Let me start with a paradox. For nearly 30 years, we've been storing CO2 underground in dozens of locations around the world, even here in TEDxØygarden, safely, without a single leak back to the atmosphere. It is one of the most mature technologies to combat climate change. Yet, when people hear about putting CO2 underground, their very first reaction is, "Yeah, that sounds way too risky. It's just going to leak out." Here's another paradox. Lots of things you do in your daily life, like turning on the lights, heating your home, even throwing out the trash, is contributing to the problem. But with carbon capture and storage, or CCS for short, those very same actions could actually be part of the solution. Take waste incineration in Europe, for example. Now, burning trash may not exactly sound clean or climate friendly, but compared to landfills, waste energy plants help prevent dangerous methane emissions, they generate electricity, and they even provide district heating to households and businesses. But they also release CO2, accounting for up to 2% of EU's emissions. And in some places like Norway, waste energy plants are some of the largest emitters in local communities. That's the case in Bergen, Norway, where I live. But here's a hidden secret. If we capture and store the CO2 from that process, we're actually going one step beyond just reducing emissions. Household waste usually contains more than 50% organic matter. That's carbon that's already been pulled from the atmosphere by plants and trees. So by capturing and storing that carbon, we actually create negative emissions. And why is that important? Negative emissions are actually a critical way of reducing not just the CO2 emissions that we are putting into the atmosphere today, but also for pulling out the emissions from the atmosphere that were put into the atmosphere by our parents, by our grandparents, by our great-grandparents, long before we knew the effects of climate change. So a community with a waste energy plant with CCS could actually be very proud to say, our trash helps clean the atmosphere. So here's the idea I want to share with you today. CO2 storage is one of the safest, most scalable, and yet somehow most paradoxical climate solutions we have. But by understanding the science behind how it works, it's the key to seeing its potential. Of course, it feels natural to worry, and I get it. CO2 is a gas, gas is lighter than water, bubbles rise. So if I'm telling you I'm going to shove a lot of CO2 underground, your natural instinct is to say, okay, it's just going to come back up again, right? And we know this feeling from daily life. I pump up my bike tires and they eventually lose pressure. The water pipes in your house might seep. That lid on a jar in your cupboard, it's not airtight forever. Nothing really seems like a perfect seal. But that's where nature kicks in. The beauty of nature is that underground, we don't rely on any one single lid that might eventually fail. There are multiple lids, some of them physical, some of them chemical, but they all act together to trap the CO2 underground for a long, long time. That's what we call redundancy. It's nature's very own redundancy. And I'm an engineer, and I will tell you, engineers love redundancy. It's what keeps building from falling down. Not just one single failure, you need multiple. It keeps bridges from collapsing, and generally speaking, redundancy is behind what keeps our society safe. So deep underground, there were layers upon layers of muddy, hardened rock that have been deposited over millions and millions of years. And they have also kept oil and gas underground for millions and millions of years until we drilled holes to pull it all out. I'll come back to that in a second. CO2 is also not just this giant bubble of gas sitting underground. It's been squeezed into billions of tiny microscopic pores, like water in a sponge. Let's take a second to think about what it's like to squeeze out a sponge. A wet sponge full of water, you pick it up out of the sink, and I squeeze it, and a lot of that water comes out. But no matter how hard I squeeze that sponge, there's a lot of water that stays behind. Why? It's surface tension. Surface tension holds it in, and that's exactly what's happening deep underground. CO2 can move into the sponge, it can move through the sponge, but a lot of it gets trapped behind in those tiny, tiny pores. And it's not just a theory. We know it works in practice. Go back into my oil and gas. We ask any petroleum engineer how easy it is to get the oil and gas out of the ground. Did you know that all the drilling and pumping and treatments the oil and gas industry uses and spends trillions of dollars on, they can't get it all out. Huge amounts of oil stay trapped permanently underground. And those are the same physics that we rely on for CO2 storage. We're actually quite lucky because we can take advantage of the physics instead of trying to fight against it. Now another seemingly paradox. CO2 is not poison. I mean, you wouldn't want to walk into a sealed room full of it, but we're breathing in and out every day. It's in our oceans, it's in our forests, our farms, our backyards. It's part of the natural carbon cycle of life on Earth. Every year, the Earth's carbon cycle pumps billions of tons of carbon from the air, the land, and the ocean, a vast natural exchange that's like the heartbeat of our planet. Our emissions are actually really quite small compared to this flow, only a few percent. So the problem isn't that CO2 is unnatural. The problem is if we put way too much of it in the wrong place, the atmosphere. And even those small imbalances, just a few percent every year, has been enough to tip the whole climate system out of whack. So back to that leakage problem. With all this background CO2, it is in fact pretty hard to detect the leak. Small leak, you would need the most advanced technology, a lot of money, and quite a lot of luck. And it takes even more CO2 for it to make any difference for the plants and trees and animals living nearby. And so, of course, we're going to keep a very close eye on storage projects. We don't intend for them to leak, and we certainly don't believe it. And that's, of course, the most responsible thing to do. But what I'm here to say today is that the real danger is not a leak from storage. The real danger is failing to store CO2 in the first place and just letting billions of tons keep piling up in the sky. So instead of focusing only on leakage, let's think about another seemingly paradox: abundance. Suitable rocks for CO2 storage are all around us. Geologists have mapped hundreds of years' worth of storage, and that's enough room for thousands of billions of tons of CO2. Thousands of billions of tons of CO2. What does that even mean? That is enough storage to capture all the emissions from every cement plant, steel mill, and power plant in Europe, not just for a decade or a century, but multiple centuries. The numbers are indeed staggering. So when people start hearing these kinds of numbers, thousands of billions of tons, okay, there's no leakage, but isn't the surface of the Earth going to start to bulge to make room for all of this? Well, again, no. There's physics. We're putting CO2 very deep underground, thousands and thousands of kilometers. The pressures are immense, and CO2 is compressed into a very dense liquid. It takes up way less space than what it does in the air. And it's not sitting in these vast caverns. It's spreading out into all these tiny microscopic pores and creating a layer of CO2 on top of a lot of salty water that has been there already for millions of years. So how, again, do we picture these physics? So I go back to my lowly kitchen sponge, and I want you to imagine scaling it up. Really, really, really. 100-meter thick sandstone, a slab of rock, extending for kilometers and kilometers in every direction. Remember, it's buried very deep, and it's filled with that salty water, but how do we picture the scale? This is the skyline of Manhattan. Building after building, block after block. This is, in fact, the size of a typical CO2 storage reservoir, sandstone, in both the extent, but also the height. Now imagine I take a single office chair out of one of these buildings and I put it next to me. That's about a cubic meter of sandstone. That cubic meter of sandstone holds hundreds of billions of tiny microscopic pores. And if they were empty, I could put a half a ton of CO2 in that office chair. That's about the same amount of CO2 you would emit flying from Europe across the Atlantic, just one way. So every year, a project like this is injecting millions of tons of CO2, about 2 million of my office chairs. But again, where is the CO2 going? It's very dense, but it's still lighter than the salt water that's already filling up these buildings. So CO2 will rise up, just like all of the elevators, all the way to the top. And it's prevented from going any farther because why? The layer upon layer of muddy rock extending 2 kilometers up into the sky, acting like a roof and keeping all of that CO2 in place. And even after millions and millions of CO2 have been put into these skyscrapers, it still only takes up enough space to fill just the top floors of each one. And from the surface, 2 kilometers up, you won't notice a thing. It's kind of like the insulation in the ceiling above your heads. It's there, silent, just doing its job. It's always hard to get a sense of these scales. And it's, okay, one more thing. If you take a library of bookshelves, these are bookshelves, you imagine, these are filled with salty water, kind of like my skyscrapers. And I take my new CO2, and what do? I'm not going to take the books off the bookshelves. I have to put them somewhere else. But actually, it's possible, and you know this intuitively. I take a new book, and I can usually fit a new book somewhere in there. There's always room for one more book. That bookshelf's not going to give. And I take this, again, a new project, and I find a new spot, nestle a new book in there. And I take this project after project across continents over the entire globe. And I think you should try to get a sense of the true scale of this. This potential library for CO2 is so vast, it could hold those thousands of billions of tons of CO2. Abundance is not the problem. The real problem is letting all of this become sitting unused while we keep letting emissions rise. So we have the space, we have the science, we just need the will to scale it up. So let's go back to where we started. The paradox of carbon storage is that something that seems so risky is in fact one of the safest climate solutions we have. And that something relatively invisible could make such a visible difference for our future. And that the very rocks beneath our feet or beneath our oceans have enormous possibility for taking our everyday emissions and turning them into long-term solutions for our world. So CO2 storage isn't about hiding problems. It's about revealing possibilities. And if we choose to use it, we can put a lot of carbon back where it came from, deep underground. And then we give ourselves a fighting chance against climate change. And we go from something that's a paradox to a possibility. Thank you.